Today I'd like to walk you through a coaching model. The purpose of this model is to help give you a framework and a structure to walk someone through a coaching conversation from beginning to end with some particular outcome. And that outcome is to help them gain more clarity on their issue or their challenge or their obstacle. So the first thing we need to make sure is we create a comfortable, open coaching environment. And how do you do that? You have to build trust. You have to have trust with the coachee. So one way is to make sure that they're comfortable, they have a relationship with you, and that they're open to discussing their particular challenge or their coaching gap with you. It's always important to begin by stating your intention. What's the purpose of this conversation? Why are you sitting them down and having a coaching engagement or conversation with them? And they need to be clear that you have their best interests at heart. Often I state my intentions before I begin the coaching conversation. I might say to an employee, I really value you. I know this job is important to you, and I'd like to have a conversation about something that I think will help you be more successful here long term. Are you open to having a conversation about that? In that way, I've stated my intention, and then I've asked permission, which is the next important step, is to make sure the coachee is willing and able and open and comfortable to be coached. The other important thing to keep in mind is that our words are not all of our communication, and our body language makes a big difference as well, and is really the key thing behind what we're communicating. So are you smiling? Are you leaning forward? Do you have your arms crossed? Is your body language open and warm? Or is it closed and judgmental? So we want to make sure we have open, comfortable body language that engages the coachee and makes them feel safe and comfortable in sharing with us their challenges, their obstacles, and disclosing their gaps. All right, so models are helpful to give us a framework and a grounding as to where we've started, where we are, and where we're going. It's sort of a map. Not all models work in every situation. However, it gives us something we can come back to. And a coaching conversation can be quite fluid and dynamic. And sometimes we get to the point where we feel a little bit stuck. We don't know where to go with it or where to take the coachee next. And so this simple 5-step coaching model that I'm going to present to you will help you take them through from beginning till end and have something to come back to when you're not sure where to go next. All right. So this is a really simplistic coaching model. The idea is to start with the coachee where they are today. What's their current situation or reality? What's the state of their performance? What's the state of their financial situation? What's the state of their health potentially? What's the state of their relationship? Whatever their current reality is that they're at. And then what we're trying to do is get them to move towards whatever their goal is, the reality they would like to have in the future. So clearly, by looking at this model in front of me, you can see that there's a gap between their current reality and the goal of where they would like to be. So the 5 steps are very simple. I will walk you through each of these. And the first step on a high level is to get them to focus. We need to get clear on what the issue is. Oftentimes, the issue is complicated and there's many layers. Then we need to help them figure out what's possible given what their issue is. Then we will help draw out a plan of action so that they have some possibility and movement that's possible in towards their goal. We'll make sure we help them uncover their barriers. And then we're going to make sure we recap at the end to make sure that they're clear on what they've decided and what their plan is, and then what we can hold them accountable to. So let's walk through each of these steps. All right, here we go. Now, the other thing we need to keep in mind that there's 4 very specific coaching skills that we need in order to coach effectively. I will cover those in the next module that we'll discuss, but that is effective listening, really good discovery questioning, having neutral and objective messaging, and then acknowledging and celebrating the individual and their success. So we need to keep those skills in mind as we're walking through the coaching model. These things come hand in hand, and we need to demonstrate good coaching skills while we are following our map. All right, step 1, the coaching conversation model. Step 1. First, we need to establish focus. Now, this is difficult. Oftentimes when someone's upset or they have an obstacle in their life, they want to talk about it. They want to express their emotions around it. They want to be frustrated, and they want to share a lot of stories about what's happened. Your job as the coach in this very first step is to make sure that they articulate what it is that's at the root of what's causing them difficulty. So you're only asking questions in this stage, and you're listening attentively. And you're not listening to who said what and what happened when. You're listening below the story. That is, why are they telling me this story, and what is it that's really going on for them in their life right now? As opposed to getting caught up in who said what or who did what. Okay, so we're searching for the real issue. Now, you might find that a couple issues are uncovered. I don't like my job, I don't like my boss, and I'm not making enough money. So those might be 3 things that come out in one coaching conversation. So then your job in this step is to say, here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing there's 3 issues going on for you. We don't have the time today to address all 3 of those. Which one do you think is most important to talk about first? Or which one of those would create the most change in your life if you could shift in some way? Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to establish focus. We're going to listen attentively. We'll ask questions to help them get clear on what they believe their problem is. Now, you might be tempted to discover in your own mind what their problem is and to label it, identify it. But that's not your job in this case. It's the coachee's job to identify what's at the root and the most important thing for them to shift. Once we know what that gap is or what that issue is, we can move on to step 2. Step 2 is our job to help them identify possibilities for themselves as to what can they do about their situation. Now, it's very easy for us to sit back and say, oh, I think I know what this person's problem is, and here's 10 things they can do. And we want to give them advice, or we want to give them our opinion, and our intentions are good. It's because we want to help them, and they haven't thought of these things themselves yet. However, this is not our role as the coach. And instead, again, we're going to ask powerful questions. So one question might be, what have you tried to do about this? What have you tried in the past? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What could you do differently? What is a possibility for you to try? What would help you get closer to what you want? Okay, so we're going to be asking a lot of what, how questions. Again, we're listening more than we're talking. We have a quiet, open mind. And the really important thing here is not to judge their answers or their solutions, even though we might think, oh, that's a dumb idea, or that'll never work. But to then listen carefully and help them search for more answers. Now, you'll find that oftentimes they'll not have a problem coming up with 1 or 2 possibilities or solutions or alternatives. But your job is to make sure you pull 3 or 4 out of them so that they have more to work with. Okay? So when you ask the questions, what else could you try? And they say, well, I don't know. That's it. I can't think of anything else. If I would have done it by now. Then you can always ask the very last question. And that is, if you knew what you needed to do, what would that be? Somehow that question gets into their deeper layer of understanding and knowing, and usually they blurt out something, well, if I had to, I guess I could do X. And you'll find that sometimes that's the most powerful step for them and possibility for them to move them forward. They're just resistant and reluctant to identify it because they don't really want to do it. And yet they know in their heart that that's the most important thing they have to do to make progress. All right. Now, when you're finished discovering possibilities and you think you've exhausted all of the options they could take to solve their problem, it's your job as the coach to paraphrase and recap what you heard before you move on to step 3. So I might say, okay, so what I heard today is that you are unhappy at work, and that the three possibilities you've identified is to talk to your boss, to quit your job, or to try and get a promotion. And I want to ask them if that's correct, if those are the options that they find are the most viable. Then I might ask them to choose out of those possibilities which one would be the best one to begin with. Okay? Now we're going to move on to the next step. Now, by the way, one last point is if I do feel that I have an option or a possibility for them that they haven't thought of themselves, I'm still not going to tell them, oh, have you tried this? Could you do that? You should do this. I'm not going to give advice or an opinion, but I could ask them if they're open to hearing a story about what I've heard has worked for someone else. Or I might use I language and say, you know, when I had a problem at work, what I found helped me was X. This works because I'm sharing my story and I'm talking about myself, and they can choose to agree or disagree with my idea or my sharing, as opposed to me saying, oh, you should try this. That worked for me. Okay, so we're going to use I language and share our experience or somebody else's story, and they can then choose to either take that idea and make it their own and get more buy-in as a result, or they can say, oh, that's interesting, but nah, that'll never work for me. Or they might say, oh, yeah, I tried that. It didn't work. Okay? So that's how you can give advice without giving advice, is to share the story yourself and use I language. Okay, next step, planning the action. Here your job as the coach is to help draw out baby steps that they can take to get movement forward. Remember, they're stuck. They have a gap. They're frustrated. They don't know what to do, and this is weighing heavily on them. Your job, by the end of this very short coaching conversation, is to get them to feel more positive and optimistic and feel like they have a plan, that they know what to do. We're going to draw out outcomes here. So you said, you could talk to your boss. So let's talk about that. What would be possible? What could you do? What's a first good step? What could you do next? How could you get started on this? We're going to ask a lot of how, what type of questions. Hopefully they pick something. And by the way, this is what you will also hold them accountable for because they've identified it as their first step. And when you've finished identifying a plan with them and they've come up with what they're going to do next, you can recap that again and recap step 3 before moving on to the next step. All right. Step 4. You know what the problem is. They have a number of possible options to solve it. You've helped them identify their priority and which one they're going to do first. They've now come up with a first step, an action that they do towards that. Now it's your job in this particular step is to help them identify what is going to get in the way. What will stop them? Okay, so here we're going to ask questions like, okay, that sounds like a good plan. What do you think could get in the way? Another question might be, if for some reason you weren't able to do this, what do you think that reason would be? Okay, or what are the obstacles to making this happen? Once they've identified the obstacles and they realize, oh, you know what, it's not going to be as easy as I thought. And by the way, it might be a tangible obstacle like, oh, my boss is out of town, I can't set up a meeting with him. Or it might be something more internal and intrinsic, something like a fear or limiting belief. Oh, I can't talk to my boss because he's just going to say no anyway. Okay, so you might uncover some emotional obstacles or resistance or some fears, and that's what's really stopping them. And your job now in this stage is to help them not just identify the barriers, but find a way to help them overcome them or have them work through whatever that resistance is. Okay, so if they have some fears, we might explore it here and say, okay, well, what would help you feel less frightened to do that? Or what would make it more comfortable for you to do that? And hopefully you can help them work through their fear and their resistance and any barriers that will stop them from being successful in taking this step towards the outcome they want. Okay, and again, after each step, we're going to recap and move forward. Last step in the coaching conversation. So this is fairly difficult because you're going to recap the entire conversation in 1 or 2 sentences. And you're going to get the coachee to do the summary and the recap first before you recap as well. Okay, so one classic easy question that I like to ask at the end of a coaching conversation that works every time, and you can, modify yours to your own style or approach. And so what I ask is, okay, so what are you taking away from our conversation today? And that question forces them to recap and summarize everything we just discussed. And hopefully they'll say, well, I've realized this is my problem. These are some solutions. The one I think I want to take is this one. And even though these are the obstacles, here's how I'm going to handle that. And this is what I'm going to do next week. Okay. Now, when they finished recapping, I might then say, okay, so what I'm hearing is that this is your plan. And I can do a second recap and summary of what they've said. And that's a useful tool if we feel that they've missed something that was important that came up in the conversation that they didn't identify in their summary or recap. And usually what I find, I'll say, okay, so what I think I heard you say was this and this. And they often will say, oh, yeah, you're right. I forgot about that. Yeah, no, that's really important. I got to do that too. All right. Now, we're going to acknowledge them. We're going to thank them for being open and honest and sharing with us today. And then we will set a next step for accountability. So is it okay if I follow up with you next week to see how that goes? Or would you be comfortable sending me an email this weekend and letting me know how it went? Okay, so we will end the coaching conversation with the recap and then set a next step of accountability so that we can continue the process and supporting them. And that is the 5-step coaching model in a nutshell. Thanks. Have a great practice session. I hope this will help you. And I firmly believe that if you follow these steps in every coaching conversation that you have, it will help you create movement and a shift in the coachee, that they will come into the conversation upset or frustrated or stuck. And then even within 10 minutes of following these 5 steps, at the end of the conversation, I can promise you that that person will have a shift. At least they will feel more hopeful and positive, and their energy will change compared to what it was like in the beginning. And no, you won't solve all their life problems in 10 minutes or in one coaching conversation, but you can definitely open the door and get them feeling good about their life and the possibilities and hopeful and optimistic that they can close their gap. Have a great day and happy coaching.